Eleanor Winters had been married for 23 years when she first noticed David Morris looking at her as if she were actually visible. Not just visible seen. It happened at the university faculty Christmas party, an annual event that Eleanor had attended for nearly 2 decades, standing dutifully beside her husband Richard as he discussed departmental politics with colleagues who barely acknowledged her presence. She was 48 years old, and somewhere along the way, she had forgotten that she was still alive. More wine. David appeared at her elbow, bottle of Cabernet in hand, his eyes meeting hers with a directness that made her momentarily forget to breathe. Please. She extended her glass, aware of a slight tremor in her fingers. David was new to the physics department, where Richard had taught for 20 years younger by perhaps a decade, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and a habit of pushing his glasses up when he was thinking. She had met him only twice before, at the department picnic and at a dinner Richard had hosted for new faculty. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, and unlike the perfunctory questions others lobbed her way before turning back to Richard, David remained focused on her, waiting for an actual answer. Eleanor found herself at a loss. When was the last time anyone had genuinely inquired about her enjoyment of anything? Richard checked in about logistics and schedules, but the nuances of her happiness had faded from their conversations years ago. She scrambled for something witty or insightful, but landed on the truth instead. "I'm standing in a corner drinking wine while my husband discusses quantum theory. It's what I do at these events." David laughed, the sound warm and unexpected. "That sounds profoundly boring." "It is rather." She smiled, surprised at her own candor. "So what do you do when you're not standing in corners at physics department parties?" Eleanor hesitated. What did she do? Once, she had been a promising architectural historian, on track for tenure at a small liberal arts college. But when Richard had been offered the prestigious position at the university, they had moved. Her own career had been relegated to something to figure out later. Later had never come. "I volunteer at the art museum," she said, which was true, but not the whole truth. She also spent hours wandering the galleries alone, staring at paintings that made her ache with their beauty and violence. "And I'm working on a book about late 19th century architectural movements." This too was only partly true. She had been working on the book for 13 years. There were notes everywhere in her home office, and sometimes months would go by when she convinced herself she was making progress. But the manuscript itself remained stubbornly incomplete. "That sounds fascinating." David leaned slightly closer, his interest seemingly genuine. "What aspect of 19th century architecture?" Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the follow-up question. Most people nodded politely and changed the subject. "The integration of new industrial materials with traditional forms," she said. "How architects navigated the tension between innovation and classical beauty." "Like the Crystal Palace?" David asked. Eleanor felt a flicker of genuine excitement. "Exactly. The Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 was revolutionary, this massive structure of glass and iron that completely transformed what people thought buildings could be." "I saw a documentary about it once," David said. "Didn't it burn down?" "In 1936, Eleanor nodded, surprised he knew even that much. "But its influence was enormous. The tension between new materials and old forms, between transparency and solidity, it's a fascinating period of architectural history." "The tension between transparency and solidity," David repeated thoughtfully. "That's quite beautiful, the way you put that." Eleanor felt herself flush. Across the room, she caught sight of Richard, deep in conversation with the department chair, gesturing animatedly. He hadn't looked for her once. "Richard says you're brilliant," David said, following her gaze. "That your architectural analysis is groundbreaking." Eleanor nearly choked on her wine. "Richard said that?" "At the faculty lunch last week. Someone asked what his wife did, and he went on for quite a while about your work. Said you had insights no one else in the field had considered." Eleanor stared across the room at her husband with new eyes. Richard, talking about her work? With pride? When was the last time he had even asked about her research? "That's surprising," she managed. "Why?" David looked genuinely confused. Eleanor hesitated, unused to such direct questions from near strangers. "We don't really discuss my work anymore," she admitted. "He's very busy with his research, and she stopped. unsure how to finish. "And you're what?" "Not as productive as I once was," she said finally. David studied her face, his own expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the most important thinking happens in the quiet periods," he said. "At least that's been my experience. The fallow times when it seems like nothing's happening, but underneath, everything is rearranging itself." Eleanor felt something inside her chest expand painfully. "Yes," she whispered. "That's it exactly." The band began playing a jazz standard, the notes of autumn leaves floating through the decorated ballroom. Eleanor glanced at her nearly empty wine glass. "Would you like to dance?" David asked suddenly. Eleanor looked up, startled. "Oh, just one dance," he said lightly. "These department parties need all the help they can get." Eleanor hesitated, looking across the room at Richard. He was still deep in conversation, his back to her. She set down her wine glass. "All right," she said. "One dance." David led her to the small dance floor where a few other couples were swaying to the music. He placed his hand respectfully at her waist, taking her other hand in his. They moved together with surprising ease. "So, Mrs. Winters," he said as they turned, "tell me about the book you're not writing." Eleanor laughed, caught off guard by his perceptiveness. "That obvious, is it?" "A little," he admitted. "You get a certain look when you're not telling the whole truth. A tiny furrow right here." He nearly touched the space between her eyebrows, but stopped himself. The almost touch hung in the air between them. "The book is stalled," she admitted. "Has been for years." "Why?" Eleanor thought about the question as they moved across the floor. Why indeed? The reason seemed both enormous and trivial. "Life got in the way," she said finally. "Richard's career took off. We moved. I lost my academic position. And then, inertia, I suppose. The longer I went without working on it, the harder it became to start again." David nodded. "And what would it take to start again?" Eleanor blinked at him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I haven't thought about it that way in a long time." The song ended, and they stood for a moment, still connected. Then Eleanor stepped back, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Thank you for the dance," she said formally. "My pleasure." David's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "I'd like to hear more about your work sometime." Before Eleanor could respond, Richard appeared beside them. "There you are," he said to Eleanor, his tone distracted. "I've been looking for you." "No, you haven't," Eleanor thought. "You haven't looked for me in years." "Richard," David nodded collegially, "I was just getting to know your wife. She was telling me about her research on 19th century architecture." Richard blinked, then smiled, putting his arm around Eleanor's shoulders. "Yes, she's brilliant. Been working on this book forever, though." He squeezed her shoulder, the gesture both affectionate and dismissive. "One of these days, she'll actually finish it, won't you, Elle?" Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of love and frustration. This was Richard, thoughtless sometimes, but not unkind. She had built a life with him, raised children with him, loved him. She still loved him. But when had he stopped seeing her? "The department chair's wife wants to talk to you," Richard was saying, already steering her away. "Something about the charity auction." Eleanor glanced back at David, who was watching them with an unreadable expression. He raised his hand in a small wave, and she felt an unexpected pang of loss at the abrupt end to their conversation. The ride home was quiet, Richard humming tunelessly as he drove, Eleanor staring out the window at the Christmas lights blurring past. "Did you have a good time?" Richard asked absently, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I had an interesting conversation with David Morris." "MMM," Richard nodded, turning onto their street. "Smart fellow. Bit of a loner, though. Divorced last year, I heard." Eleanor looked at her husband's profile in the dim light of the car. When had those lines appeared around his eyes? When had his hair become more salt than pepper? "He asked about my book," she said carefully. "What book?" Richard frowned, then his expression cleared. "Oh, your architecture thing." "Right. Your architecture thing. 20 years of research and thought, reduced to a thing." He seemed genuinely interested. Eleanor continued, unsure why she was pressing the point. Richard pulled into their driveway, cutting the engine. "Well, he's new. Trying to make connections." He leaned over and pressed a quick kiss to her cheek, a habit more than a gesture of affection. "Come on, let's get inside. It's freezing." Their house was dark and quiet. The children were grown: Michael in his second year of medical school, Emma working at a tech startup in Seattle. The silence felt heavy as they moved through their nighttime routines with practiced efficiency. In bed, Richard was already scrolling through emails on his phone while Eleanor removed her earrings and placed them in the small ceramic dish on her nightstand. "He said you talked about my work at the faculty lunch," she said, her back to Richard. "That you called it groundbreaking." Richard looked up from his phone, distracted. "Who did?" "David Morris." "Oh." Richard set his phone down, seeming to give the conversation his full attention for the first time. "Well, Carlson asked what you did, and I mentioned your research. You know I've always thought your ideas were brilliant, Elle." Eleanor turned to look at him. "Have you? It's been so long since we've talked about it." Richard's expression softened. "Just because we don't talk about it doesn't mean I don't think it." He patted the bed beside him. "Come here." Eleanor slipped beneath the covers, allowing Richard to pull her against him. His body was familiar: the slight softness at his middle, the warmth of his skin, the rhythm of his breathing. 23 years of intimacy had created a vocabulary of touch that required no translation. "I'm proud of you," Richard murmured, his voice already heavy with approaching sleep. "Always have been." Eleanor lay awake long after Richard's breathing had deepened into soft snores. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about transparency and solidity, about the fallow periods when everything rearranges itself beneath the surface. She thought about the way David had looked at her as if she were fascinating, as if her words mattered. And she thought about the tiny shock of awareness that had traveled up her arm when they danced, the way time had seemed to slow and expand around them. It was nothing, she told herself firmly. A pleasant conversation, that's all. A moment of being seen after so long feeling invisible. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, Eleanor could still feel the gentle pressure of David's hand at her waist, the warmth of his gaze locked on hers. And in the darkness of her bedroom, lying beside the man she had loved for more than half her life, she felt something stir that she had thought long dormant: a hunger to be known, to be understood, to matter deeply to someone who was paying attention. It was nothing, she told herself again. But she knew, even as consciousness slipped away, that it was a lie. 3 weeks after the Christmas party, Eleanor found herself lingering in the university library. She hadn't planned to be there. She had simply dropped off some books Richard had forgotten at home. But instead of leaving immediately, she wandered through the stacks, trailing her fingers along the spines of art history volumes she hadn't consulted in years. It was a Tuesday afternoon in January, the campus quiet between classes. Snow fell softly outside the tall windows, muffling the world. Eleanor pulled a book about Beaux-Arts architecture from the shelf and sat at an empty table, losing herself in the familiar comfort of architectural theory. "Well, this is a pleasant surprise." Eleanor looked up to find David Morris standing beside her table, a stack of physics journals under one arm. His glasses were slightly fogged from the transition from the cold outdoors to the heated library, and snowflakes were melting in his dark hair. "David," she said, closing her book with an inexplicable flutter of nerves. "Hello. Mind if I join you?" he asked, already pulling out the chair across from her. "Please." She gestured to the seat, suddenly aware of her casual appearance: no makeup, hair pulled back in a simple knot, wearing jeans and an old cashmere sweater. She hadn't expected to see anyone she knew. "Beaux-Arts architecture?" David nodded at her book. "Is that related to your research?" Eleanor was touched that he remembered. "Tangentially. I'm looking at how classical forms persisted even as new materials and methods emerged. There was this fascinating tension between innovation and tradition. Like people clinging to the familiar even as they're drawn to the new," David suggested, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at his words. Was he flirting with her? The thought was so foreign she nearly dismissed it outright. "Something like that," she said carefully. "What brings you to the library?" "I would have thought the physics department had its own collection." "It does, but I prefer the quiet here." He glanced around the nearly empty reading room. "And sometimes it's good to step away from your own department. Get a different perspective." Eleanor nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I used to spend hours in libraries," she admitted, "before life got so structured." David suggested. "I was going to say predictable, but yes, Structured works too. They fell into an easy conversation about their favorite libraries. David had spent a year at Oxford and spoke reverently of the Bodleian. Eleanor countered with her love of the Boston Public Library's reading room. Time slipped by unnoticed until Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Where are you? Thought you were just dropping off my books." Eleanor glanced at her watch, startled to see that nearly an hour had passed. "I should go," she said, gathering her things. "Richard is wondering where I am." David nodded, something like disappointment flickering across his face. "Of course." He hesitated, then asked, "Will you be at the department lecture series this Friday? I'm presenting some of my recent work." Eleanor hadn't planned to attend. These academic events were Richard's domain, and she had stopped accompanying him to most of them years ago. But she found herself nodding. "I'd like that," she said. "What time?" 4 o'clock, Barton Hall." David's smile was warm. "I'll save you a seat." As Eleanor drove home, her mind kept returning to the hour in the library, the easy flow of conversation, the way David had listened to her, really listened, as she talked about architecture. When was the last time anyone had looked at her with such focused interest? At home, Richard barely glanced up from his laptop when she entered his study. "There you are," he said. "Did you get caught in traffic?" "No," Eleanor said, hanging her coat on the hook by the door. "I was in the library. I ran into David Morris." "David!" Richard looked up briefly. "Oh, right. Nice guy. A bit intense." Eleanor thought about David's focused gaze, the way he leaned forward slightly when she was speaking, as if to catch every word. Intense wasn't the word she would have chosen. Attentive, perhaps. Present. "He invited me to his lecture on Friday," she said, watching Richard's face. "You don't usually come to those departmental talks," Richard said, returning to his email. "I know, but I thought I might. It's been a while since I've been involved with the department." Richard looked up again, his expression faintly puzzled. "Well, sure if you want to. Though you'll probably be bored, it's pretty technical stuff." Eleanor felt a familiar pang of irritation. Richard had always assumed she couldn't understand or wouldn't be interested in his work, despite her own academic background. She had a master's degree in architectural history and had been halfway through a PhD program when they moved for his job. "I think I can manage," she said, a bit more sharply than she intended. Richard blinked at her tone. "Of course you can," he said quickly. "I just meant the subject matter might not interest you. But you should absolutely come if you want to." He gave her a distracted smile before turning back to his laptop. Eleanor left the study, feeling dismissed. In the kitchen, she began preparing dinner with more force than necessary, chopping vegetables with quick, precise movements. She was being unfair to Richard, she knew. He wasn't intentionally dismissive. He was simply absorbed in his work. And yet, when had they stopped really seeing each other? When had their conversations become so functional, so limited to the logistics of their shared life? Her phone buzzed with a text notification, and Eleanor wiped her hands to check it. "It was nice running into you today. Looking forward to seeing you Friday. David." Eleanor stared at the message, her heart beating a little faster. David must have gotten her number from the department directory, where she was still listed as Richard's emergency contact. The fact that he had made the effort to look it up sent a small thrill through her. She typed a response, deleted it, then typed again. "It was lovely talking with you too. See you Friday." She hesitated, then added, "I'm looking forward to it." Eleanor set her phone down, feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. It was just a friendly text, just a departmental lecture. Nothing inappropriate about any of it. So why did it feel like she was keeping a secret? Friday arrived cold and clear, the January sun bright, but offering little warmth. Eleanor spent more time than usual getting ready, trying on and discarding several outfits before settling on a charcoal gray dress and a simple silver necklace Richard had given her for their 20th anniversary. "You look nice," Richard commented as they walked across campus toward Barton Hall. "New dress?" "No," Eleanor said, somewhat pleased he had noticed her appearance. "Just haven't worn it in a while." The lecture hall was nearly full when they arrived, faculty and graduate students filing into the tiered seating. Richard was immediately drawn into a conversation with colleagues, and Eleanor stood awkwardly at his side until she heard her name. "Eleanor!" David was at the front of the room, setting up his presentation. He waved her over with a warm smile. "I saved you a seat," he said, indicating a chair in the front row. "Unless you prefer to sit with Richard?" Eleanor glanced back at her husband, who was now deep in conversation with the department chair. "He seems occupied," she said. "Thank you for saving me a place." She settled into the seat David had reserved, aware of curious glances from a few faculty members who knew her. David leaned close, his voice low. "Fair warning, this talk gets pretty technical in the middle, but I try to bookend it with material accessible to non-physicists." Eleanor smiled, touched by his consideration. "I'm sure I'll manage. I lived with a physicist for 23 years. I've picked up a thing or two." David's lecture focused on quantum entanglement, a concept Eleanor understood in broad strokes from Richard's work. But unlike Richard, who often grew impatient with lay explanations, David had a gift for making complex ideas accessible. He used metaphors and visual aids, frequently making eye contact with Eleanor as if checking that she was following. "When two particles become entangled," he explained, projecting an animation on the screen, "they form a connection that transcends physical distance. You can separate them by light years, and still, what happens to one instantaneously affects the other." Eleanor found herself drawn in by the poetry of the concept two entities, once connected, forever influenced by each other regardless of distance or time. She glanced back at Richard, who was watching the presentation with professional interest, occasionally making notes. After the lecture, there was a small reception with coffee and cookies. Richard immediately joined a group of colleagues discussing some technical aspect of David's presentation. Eleanor stood alone, feeling once again like the invisible faculty wife, until David appeared at her side, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "So," he said, offering her one of the cups, "what did you think? Too technical?" "Not at all," Eleanor replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You have a remarkable ability to make complex ideas accessible. The way you described quantum entanglement was almost poetic." David's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what I was aiming for. Physics at its core is about describing the fabric of reality, which is inherently beautiful and strange. When we reduce it to just equations, we lose something essential." "Richard always says I wouldn't understand his work," Eleanor admitted. "He stopped trying to explain it to me years ago." David frowned slightly. "That's a shame. You clearly have the capacity to understand complex ideas. Your work on architectural theory requires just as much conceptual sophistication as physics does." His words sent a warm glow through Eleanor. When was the last time someone had acknowledged her intellectual capacity? "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." They talked for several minutes, standing slightly apart from the other groups. Eleanor was acutely aware of Richard across the room, though he seemed not to notice her conversation with David. "I've been thinking about our conversation in the library," David said, his voice dropping slightly. "About stepping away from your own domain for a fresh perspective." Eleanor nodded, wondering where he was going with this. "There's an exhibit at the Art Museum on industrial design and architecture," he continued. "It opened last week. I thought, perhaps you might want to see it. As a field expert, you could help me understand what I'm looking at." Eleanor hesitated. Was he asking her on a date? No, surely not. It was a professional invitation, colleague to colleague. The fact that those colleagues happened to be of opposite genders, and one was married to another colleague, was complicated, but not inherently inappropriate. "I'd like that," she said carefully. "When were you thinking?" "Next Tuesday. I teach until 3, but I'm free after that." Eleanor nodded. "Tuesday works. Shall I meet you there?" "Perfect." David smiled, and Eleanor felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. "It's a date." The phrase hung between them, both innocent and loaded with potential meaning. David seemed to realize this and quickly added, "A museum date. An educational outing between colleagues." Eleanor laughed, grateful for the tension-breaking clarification. "Yes, exactly. An educational outing." Across the room, Richard finally seemed to notice her deep conversation with David. He raised an eyebrow questioningly, and Eleanor gave a small wave. Richard excused himself from his group and made his way over. "Fascinating presentation, David," he said, clapping the younger man on the shoulder. "Though I might quibble with some of your interpretations of the Copenhagen formulation." David smiled diplomatically. I'd welcome your perspective, Richard. Perhaps we could discuss it over lunch sometime. Certainly, certainly. Richard turned to Eleanor. Ready to head home? I promised to call Michael at 7. Eleanor nodded, suddenly eager to leave. The weight of her agreement with David felt heavy in her chest, not a burden, exactly, but a presence she was acutely aware of. Thank you for coming, David said, his eyes meeting Eleanor's, briefly. Both of you. Our pleasure, Richard replied absently, already turning toward the exit. As they walked home in the crisp evening air, Richard talked excitedly about David's presentation, critiquing certain aspects while praising others. Eleanor listened, grateful that Richard was too absorbed in the physics to notice her distraction. I'm meeting a friend at the art museum on Tuesday, she said during a lull in Richard's monologue. There's a new exhibit on industrial design. Oh, that sounds nice, Richard replied, clearly thinking about something else entirely. Which friend? Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second. Jane from my book club, she said, the lie slipping out with surprising ease. Richard nodded, unsurprised and uninterested. Tell her I said hello. That night, lying awake beside her sleeping husband, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, trying to understand her own behavior. Why had she lied? There was nothing inherently wrong with visiting a museum with a colleague. And yet, she knew there was more to it than that. She felt drawn to David in a way that went beyond professional interest or casual friendship. There was an energy between them, an awareness that made her pulse quicken when he was near. It had been so long since she had felt that kind of excitement, that sense of possibility. So long since anyone had looked at her the way David did, as if she were fascinating, valuable, worth knowing. Eleanor turned on her side, watching Richard's familiar profile in the dim light from the window. She loved him. She did. They had built a life together, raised children, weathered hardships. But somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing each other, stopped really talking, stopped being curious about each other's inner lives. Was it so wrong to want to be seen again? To be heard and valued and understood? No, Eleanor told herself firmly. There was nothing wrong with friendship, with intellectual connection. She would go to the museum with David, and it would be just that, two people with shared interests enjoying an exhibit together. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, Eleanor couldn't quite silence the small voice inside her that whispered, "Who are you trying to convince?" Tuesday arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if January had briefly surrendered to spring. Eleanor stood before her closet longer than necessary, finally selecting a blue dress she hadn't worn in months. She applied makeup carefully, not too much, but enough to brighten her complexion and define her eyes. Her reflection in the mirror looked younger somehow, animated by an energy she hadn't felt in years. At 3:30, she pulled into the museum parking lot, 15 minutes earlier than they had agreed. She sat in her car, watching the dashboard clock, and trying not to analyze why her heart was beating so quickly. Just two colleagues with shared interests, she reminded herself. Nothing more. David arrived at 3:50, parking a few spaces away. Eleanor watched him through her windshield, the easy grace of his movements as he stepped from his car, the way he glanced around the parking lot, searching for her. When he spotted her car, his face broke into a smile that made her stomach flip. She took a deep breath and stepped out to meet him. "I hope you haven't been waiting long," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "Just a few minutes," she lied, suddenly self-conscious. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Shall we go in?" The museum was quiet on a Tuesday afternoon, only a few visitors wandering through the galleries. The industrial design exhibit occupied a large space on the second floor. Photographs, blueprints, and models documenting the evolution of form and function from the Industrial Revolution to the present day. Eleanor felt herself relax as they moved through the exhibit. This was her element, and she found herself explaining concepts and historical context to David, who listened with genuine interest, asking insightful questions. "It's fascinating how materials dictate form," he said as they examined a series of chair designs from different eras. Each new material, wood, steel, plastic, carbon fiber, creates its own aesthetic language. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. And there's always a period of transition where designers are using new materials but still clinging to old forms, as if they haven't quite grasped the full potential of what they're working with. Like using a cutting-edge material to recreate antique styles, David suggested. Yes, or like early automobiles that were designed to look like horse-drawn carriages, Eleanor added. It takes time for our imaginations to catch up with our innovations. They moved through the exhibit, their conversation flowing easily between architecture, design, and occasional personal asides. Eleanor found herself sharing stories from her graduate research from the years before her career had stalled. David listened intently, asking questions that made her remember details she thought she'd forgotten. You talk about architecture with such passion, he said as they paused before a model of the Barcelona pavilion. Why did you stop pursuing it professionally? The question caught Eleanor off guard. It was direct in a way people rarely were with her anymore. Most of her friends knew the broad outlines of her story, promising career sacrificed for her husband's, ambitions gradually eroding under the weight of domestic life, and had long since stopped asking. It wasn't a single decision, she said slowly. It was a series of small compromises, each one seemingly temporary. Richard's job offer here, the move away from my academic position, the children needing stability, and then, she trailed off, and then, David prompted gently, and then inertia, Eleanor admitted. The longer I was out of academia, the harder it seemed to find my way back. Grant applications went unanswered. The book stalled. Eventually, I stopped trying so hard. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. But you never stopped thinking about it, loving it. No, Eleanor said softly. I never stopped loving it. Their eyes met, and Eleanor felt a charge in the air between them, an unspoken recognition that they were no longer just talking about architecture. We should get coffee, David said abruptly. The museum cafe is supposed to be good. The cafe was nearly empty. They found a small table by the window overlooking the sculpture garden, afternoon sunlight streaming through the glass. Eleanor cupped her hands around her latte, grateful for something to do with her fingers. Tell me about your marriage, David said after a moment of comfortable silence. Eleanor looked up, startled by the directness of the question. That's quite personal, she said carefully. David held her gaze. I know. I'm sorry if it's inappropriate, but I'm trying to understand. Understand what? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew. This, David gestured between them. Whatever is happening here. Eleanor's heart raced. So he felt it too, this connection, this pull between them. The acknowledgement was both thrilling and terrifying. Nothing is happening, she said, her voice not entirely convincing even to her own ears. We're colleagues having coffee. David's smile was gentle. Eleanor, I've had coffee with many colleagues. It doesn't usually feel like this. Eleanor looked down at her cup, unable to meet his eyes. I've been married for 23 years, she said quietly. Richard and I have built a life together. We raised 2 children. We've been through a lot. That doesn't answer the question, David said softly. Eleanor sighed. How to explain a marriage of more than 2 decades? The early years of passion and shared dreams. The middle years of child-rearing and career-building. And now, the strange late phase of comfortable distance, of parallel lives intersecting mainly over household logistics and occasional shared meals. Richard is a good man, she said finally. He's brilliant and dedicated, and he cares deeply about his work. About our children. And about you? David asked. The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor thought about Richard's distracted kisses, his perfunctory inquiries about her day, the way he had stopped really seeing her years ago. Yes, she said, because it was true in its way. Richard did care about her as a fixture in his life, as the mother of his children, as a partner in the practical business of living. But not as a woman with dreams and desires of her own. Not as someone who still longed to be discovered, to be known. But, David prompted. But we've grown apart, Eleanor admitted, the words difficult after years of not acknowledging this truth even to herself. Not dramatically, not in a way that would justify something as drastic as separation. Just incrementally, day by day, until we became more like roommates than spouses. David nodded, his expression compassionate rather than judgmental. And have you talked to him about this? Eleanor shook her head. What would I say? After 23 years, I've noticed you don't really see me anymore. It sounds petty, given all we've built together. It doesn't sound petty to me, David said quietly. It sounds like the most fundamental human need to be seen, to be known. Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes and blinked them away. What about you? She asked, eager to shift the focus. Richard mentioned you were divorced. David's expression grew contemplative. Yes, about a year ago. Amicable as these things go. No children, which made it simpler in practical terms, if not emotional ones. What happened? Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. David was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. We wanted different things, he said finally. Leah wanted stability, routine, predictability. I wanted. He hesitated. Passion. Intellectual connection. The sense that we were growing together rather than just existing side by side. The parallels to her own situation were not lost on Eleanor. She felt a flutter of something dangerous recognition, possibility. And did you find that? After the divorce, she asked. David's eyes met hers. Not until recently. The implication hung between them, clear and unmistakable. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, her heart racing. David, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, we can't do this. Do what? He asked, though they both knew exactly what she meant. This, she gestured between them. Whatever this is becoming. I'm married. You're Richard's colleague. I know, David said simply. And I respect that. I respect your marriage and your loyalty to Richard. But I can't pretend I don't feel this connection between us. It's rare, Eleanor. In 42 years of life, I've never felt anything quite like it. Eleanor's breath caught. The naked honesty of his words was both terrifying and exhilarating. No one had spoken to her with such direct emotional truth in years. I should go, she said, gathering her purse. I need to think. David didn't try to stop her, but as she stood to leave, he reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. Eleanor, he said softly, I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that I see you. All of you, your brilliance, your passion, your quiet sadness. Whatever you decide, whatever happens or doesn't happen between us, please know that. Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried out of the cafe, away from the dangerous truth of his words. She drove home in a daze, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. Guilt. Certainly she had lied to Richard about where she was going, with whom she was spending the afternoon. But beneath the guilt was something else, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Desire. Not just physical attraction, though that was undeniably present, but a deeper hunger for connection, for being truly seen and understood. The house was empty when she arrived home. Richard had texted earlier that he would be late, caught in a department meeting. Eleanor was grateful for the solitude, for the chance to collect herself before facing her husband. She poured a glass of wine and carried it to her study, a small room filled with books and research materials accumulated over decades. Her laptop sat on the desk, untouched for days. She opened it now and pulled up the manuscript she had abandoned months ago, her book on architectural transitions. David's words echoed in her mind, I see you. All of you, your brilliance, your passion, your quiet sadness. Eleanor began to write, words flowing with an ease she hadn't experienced in years. She wrote about the tension between tradition and innovation, about the courage required to embrace new forms, about the fear that keeps us clinging to the familiar long after it has ceased to serve us. She was still writing when she heard Richard's key in the lock 2 hours later. She saved her work and closed the laptop, taking a deep breath before going to greet him. Hey, Richard said, shrugging off his coat. How was the museum? Did Jane enjoy the exhibit? Eleanor felt a fresh wave of guilt at the lie. It was fascinating, she said, which was true. Very thought-provoking. Richard nodded, clearly not particularly interested. That's nice. Listen, I forgot to mention the department dinner is next Friday. Dean's hosting at his home. You'll come, right? Eleanor nodded automatically. The department dinner was an annual event, one she usually dreaded, an evening of standing beside Richard while he talked shop with colleagues who barely acknowledged her presence. But this year would be different, she realized. David would be there. Of course, she said. I wouldn't miss it. Later that night, as Richard slept beside her, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, thinking about the line she was approaching perhaps had already crossed. Nothing physical had happened between her and David. No declarations, no promises, no betrayals of the flesh. But something had shifted inside her, a door opening to possibilities she had long since stopped considering. And wasn't that its own kind of infidelity? This emotional awakening, this secret connection she was nurturing outside her marriage? Eleanor turned onto her side, watching Richard's profile in the darkness. After 23 years, she knew every line of his face, every rhythm of his breathing. He was as familiar to her as her own reflection, and yet at times like this, he seemed like a stranger. What would he think if he knew about her afternoon with David? About the way her heart raced when David looked at her, the way his words made her feel seen in a way Richards hadn't in years? What would he think if he knew that for the first time in their marriage, she was keeping secrets? Eleanor's phone on the nightstand lit up with a text notification. She reached for it carefully, not wanting to wake Richard. "Thank you for today. Your insights on the exhibit were brilliant. I meant what I said. I see you, Eleanor. I've never met anyone quite like you. Sleep well. David." Eleanor stared at the message, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions: joy, guilt, longing, fear. She should delete it, she knew. She should text back that this, whatever this, was needed to stop. Instead, she found herself typing, "Thank you for listening. For really hearing me. It's been a long time since anyone has. Good night, David." She pressed send before she could reconsider, then deleted both messages from her phone. Rolling onto her back, Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm of thoughts in her mind. She was playing with fire, she knew. Nurturing this connection with David, however innocent it might seem on the surface, was dangerous to her marriage, to Richard's professional relationships, to her own sense of herself as an honest person. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt fully alive. The afternoon at the museum with David had awakened something in her that had been dormant for so long she had almost forgotten it existed: her passion for ideas, for intellectual connection, for being recognized as more than just Richard's wife or her children's mother. How had she let those parts of herself fade away? How had she accepted the gradual erosion of her identity, her ambitions, her need to be truly seen? And now that David had reawakened these dormant aspects of herself, how could she possibly go back to the quiet numbness of before? Eleanor sighed into the darkness, knowing that she stood at a crossroads. Ahead lay choices that would reshape the landscape of her life, for better or worse. Behind lay the safety of routine, of known quantities, of a marriage that provided security if not passion. As she drifted toward sleep, one thought circled in her mind. Was it possible to reclaim parts of herself that had been lost without destroying everything she had built? Could she find a way to be fully alive again without betraying the promises she had made? Eleanor didn't have answers, only questions that followed her into uneasy dreams: dreams of glass buildings where everything inside was visible, dreams of quantum entanglement where distance meant nothing, dreams of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. The week passed in a blur of conflicting emotions for Eleanor. By day, she threw herself into her writing with newfound energy, making more progress on her manuscript in 5 days than she had in the previous 5 months. By night, she lay awake beside Richard, her thoughts constantly drifting to David: his words, his gaze, the way he had looked at her as if she were the most fascinating person he had ever met. They had exchanged text messages throughout the week, ostensibly about architecture and physics, about books they had read and ideas they were exploring. On the surface, nothing inappropriate, just intellectual exchanges between colleagues with shared interests. But underneath ran a current of something deeper, unspoken but unmistakable. Reading Bachelard's The Poetics of Space and thought of you. His ideas about intimate spaces echo what you said about the tension between privacy and transparency in modern architecture. David started Feynman's lectures on physics, trying to understand your world. His joy in discovery is contagious. I can see why you chose this field, Eleanor. Funny coincidence, I was just thinking about intellectual cross-pollination between disciplines. The architectural concepts you've shared are influencing my approach to a theoretical problem I'm working on. Thank you for that gift, David. Each message made Eleanor's heart race, each response carefully crafted to maintain the veneer of professional friendship while acknowledging the deeper connection forming between them. She deleted each exchange after it concluded, a tacit admission that these conversations belonged to a hidden realm she wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Friday evening arrived, and Eleanor found herself preparing for the department dinner with uncharacteristic attention to detail. She chose a deep burgundy dress that she knew flattered her figure, spent extra time on her makeup, wore pearl earrings that brought out the warm tones in her complexion. Richard barely noticed, absorbed in reviewing notes for a paper he was working on even as they drove to the dean's home. "You look nice," he said absently when they were halfway there, the compliment so delayed it felt like an afterthought. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, wondering if he would have noticed at all if they weren't attending a social function. The dean's house was a large Victorian on the edge of campus, renovated to blend period charm with modern amenities. As they entered, Eleanor's eyes instinctively scanned the crowd for David, a flutter of anticipation in her stomach. "Richard, Eleanor, so glad you could make it." Dean Henderson approached, martini in hand. "Richard, I need to steal you for a moment. There's someone from the Research Council you should meet." Richard squeezed Eleanor's arm. "Grab a drink. I'll find you later." And just like that, she was alone, the familiar role of faculty wife, expected to hover on the periphery of her husband's professional world. Eleanor made her way to the bar, ordering a glass of white wine, and turned to survey the room. "You look beautiful," said a voice behind her. Eleanor turned to find David standing there, his eyes warm with appreciation. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, making him look both scholarly and undeniably attractive. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "You clean up rather well yourself." "Years of academic functions," he said with a smile. "One learns the uniform." He glanced around the room. "These events are always the same, aren't they? The same conversations, the same hierarchies, the same careful political maneuvering." Eleanor laughed softly. "You sound like you've been attending faculty functions for decades, not just a year." "Academic politics is remarkably consistent across institutions," David observed. "Oxford, Cornell. Here the contexts change, but the fundamentals remain the same." They fell into easy conversation, standing slightly apart from the main clusters of faculty and administrators. Eleanor was acutely aware of Richard across the room, deep in conversation with the Research Council representative, completely oblivious to her interaction with David. "How's your book coming along?" David asked. "You mentioned you'd been writing this week." Eleanor felt a surge of pleasure that he had remembered, had asked. "Surprisingly well," she admitted. "I've had a burst of productivity. Something about our conversations has unlocked something." David's smile was warm. "I'm glad. The world deserves your insights, Eleanor." "You haven't even read my work," she pointed out. "I've heard you talk about architecture. That's enough for me to know your perspective is valuable." Before Eleanor could respond, Richard appeared at her side, his hand coming to rest possessively on her lower back. "David," he nodded cordially. "How are you settling into the semester?" "Very well, thank you, Richard." David's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more formal, more guarded. "I was just telling Eleanor how much I enjoyed our conversation about architectural theory at the museum exhibit last week." Eleanor froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. She had told Richard she'd gone to the museum with Jane from her book club. Her eyes darted to Richard's face, waiting for the inevitable question, the dawning suspicion. But Richard merely nodded, clearly not having registered the inconsistency. "Eleanor has always had fascinating insights on architecture," he said absently. "Though I confess most of it goes over my head." David's eyes met Eleanor's briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the bullet dodged. "Well, not all of us can be quantum physicists," he said smoothly. "Different kinds of brilliance." Richard smiled, pleased by the implicit compliment. "Indeed. Oh, there's Marjorie, and I need to ask her about the conference panel." "Excuse me." He squeezed Eleanor's arm and drifted away again, leaving her standing with David. "I'm sorry," David said quietly. "That was careless of me. I didn't realize you hadn't told him." Eleanor felt a flush of shame. "I told him I was going with a friend from my book club," she admitted. "I don't know why. It just came out that way." David studied her face. "Perhaps because you knew, even then, that there was something happening between us that went beyond casual friendship." Eleanor couldn't deny it. "Perhaps," she acknowledged softly. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the admission hanging between them. "Come outside with me," David said suddenly. "Just for a moment. I need to talk to you without all these people around." Eleanor hesitated, looking around the crowded room. Richard was thoroughly engaged in conversation with several colleagues, unlikely to notice her absence. "All right," she said. "Just for a minute." They slipped out through the French doors onto the stone patio at the back of the house. The January night was cold, and Eleanor shivered slightly in her sleeveless dress. David immediately removed his suit jacket and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, wrapping it around herself, surrounded suddenly by his scent, soap and cedar, and something uniquely him. "Eleanor," David said, his voice serious, "I need to be honest with you. I can't stop thinking about you, about our conversations, about the way your mind works, about the light in your eyes when you talk about architecture." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I know you're married. I know this is complicated, but I haven't felt this kind of connection with someone in a very long time, maybe ever." Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest. Here it was, the explicit acknowledgement of what had been building between them, no longer veiled in academic discussions and careful metaphors. "David," she began, not sure what she was going to say. "You don't have to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I just needed you to know. And I needed to say that I would never ask you to do anything that would compromise your integrity or your marriage. If you want to keep our relationship strictly professional from now on, I'll respect that completely." Eleanor looked up at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, and felt a tide of conflicting emotions. The honorable thing would be to agree, to step back, to focus on her marriage. But the thought of losing this connection, this person who saw her so clearly, was physically painful. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I care about Richard. We have a history, a life together. But being with you, talking with you, makes me feel alive in a way I had forgotten was possible." David took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold night air. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. Eleanor nodded. "When was the last time you felt truly happy in your marriage? Not content, not comfortable, but genuinely, deeply happy." The question cut to the heart of everything Eleanor had been avoiding. She thought back over the years, searching for a moment of true connection and joy with Richard. "Our daughter's wedding," she said finally. 2 years ago. We danced at the reception, and for a few minutes, it felt like we were really seeing each other again. Like we remembered why we had fallen in love in the first place. "And since then?" David asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. "There have been pleasant moments, comfortable ones, but that feeling, that sense of being truly connected, it was fleeting. We slipped back into our patterns so quickly. Have you talked to him about how you feel?" "How can I?" Eleanor asked, her voice catching. "What would I say? I'm emotionally unfulfilled after 23 years of marriage. It sounds so trivial." "It's not trivial," David said firmly. "It's your life, your happiness." Before Eleanor could respond, the French doors opened and a group of faculty members spilled out onto the patio, laughing and talking. The intimate bubble around them burst instantly. "We should go back inside," Eleanor said, suddenly aware of how their private conversation might appear to others. David nodded, his expression regretful. "Of course." As they turned to go back in, Eleanor began to remove his jacket from her shoulders. "Keep it for now," he said. "It's cold out here. You can return it later." Inside, they separated, David moving to join a group of junior faculty, while Eleanor went to find Richard. He was still deep in conversation with the Research Council representative and barely acknowledged her return. For the rest of the evening, Eleanor moved through the party in a daze, making small talk with faculty spouses she had known for years, all the while acutely aware of David's presence across the room. Occasionally, their eyes would meet briefly, a current of understanding passing between them before they both looked away. It was nearly midnight when Richard finally indicated he was ready to leave. As they said their goodbyes, Eleanor realized she was still wearing David's jacket. "I need to return this," she told Richard, gesturing to the jacket. "It belongs to David Morris. He lent it to me when I stepped outside for some air." Richard nodded absently. "Go ahead. I'll get our coats." Eleanor crossed the room to where David stood talking with a young female professor. He excused himself when he saw Eleanor approach. "Thank you for the loan," she said, handing him the jacket. "It saved me from freezing out there." "My pleasure," David replied, his voice formal but his eyes communicating much more. As she handed him the jacket, he pressed something into her palm, a small folded piece of paper. "Good night, Eleanor. It was lovely talking with you." Eleanor slipped the paper into her purse, her heart racing. "Good night, David." In the car on the way home, Richard talked about the research opportunities the council representative had discussed, seeming not to notice Eleanor's distraction. She answered his occasional questions with monosyllables, her mind entirely focused on the note burning a hole in her purse. It wasn't until Richard was in the shower that she finally had a moment alone to unfold the small piece of paper. "I meant every word I said tonight. You deserve to be happy. Whatever you decide, know that these past weeks have been some of the most meaningful of my life. Call me if you want to talk. Anytime. D." Below was his phone number, though she already had it. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the note, feeling as if she stood on the edge of a precipice. She could step back now, return to the safety of her marriage, to the familiar patterns of her life with Richard. She could tell David that they needed to keep their distance, maintain a strictly professional relationship. Or she could step forward into unknown territory, not necessarily into an affair, but into an honest acknowledgement of her feelings for David, of the emptiness in her marriage, of her need for more than what Richard currently offered. The bathroom door opened, and Richard emerged in a cloud of steam, toweling his hair. Eleanor quickly slipped the note under her pillow. "You were quiet on the way home," Richard observed, pulling on his pajama pants. "Everything okay?" It was a perfect opening, a moment when she could have started the difficult conversation about their marriage, about her dissatisfaction, about her longing for the connection they once had. Instead, she smiled faintly. "Just tired," she said. "It was a long evening." Richard nodded, accepting her explanation without question. "It was productive, though." He slipped into bed beside her, leaning over to kiss her cheek. "Good night, Elle." "Good night," she whispered, the weight of everything unsaid pressing on her chest like a stone. Long after Richard had fallen asleep, Eleanor lay awake, David's note now hidden in the drawer of her nightstand. She thought about the choices before her, the safe harbor of her marriage versus the uncharted waters of acknowledging her feelings for David. Both paths seemed fraught with potential for pain, staying in a marriage that had lost its spark, or risking everything for a connection that might prove ephemeral. What did she want? What did she deserve? And how could she find her way to happiness without leaving destruction in her wake? Eleanor had no answers, only questions that circled in her mind as the night deepened around her. But one thing had become clear. She could no longer pretend that her feelings for David were simply friendly or collegial. Something significant had shifted inside her, a door opening to possibilities she had long since stopped considering. The question now was whether she would have the courage to walk through that door and what she might find on the other side.